Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the US Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
So let's dive into all 8 of Grisham's reasons. And the first one off the bat is bad police work.
So what John Grisham wrote is that most cops are honest, hardworking professionals, but some have been known to hide, alter, or fabricate evidence, lie on the witness stand, cut deals with snitches in return for bogus testimony, intimidate and threaten witnesses, coerce confessions, or manipulate eyewitness identifications.
I mean, I can't even tell you if even one of these are true, how scary it is. Like I said, if you're just a average guy or girl and you get a DUI or whatever, and one of these elements are there, I mean, this is scary stuff for the average person. It's
scary stuff. And, listen, in any profession, there's always bad apples. There's bad doctors, there's bad attorneys, but man, the ramifications of some of these things in someone's life can be absolutely huge. And you think about, I think one of the last things he said was manipulate eyewitness identifications. That's powerful evidence. Pre-forensic science, that's the guy. But how is that field lineup conducted? Is it completely objective?
Right. Because anything could be kind of swayed or teased up one way or another, right?
Well, that's another field where you need an expert on the defense side to come in and say, was this done?
Which goes back to the money issue.
Right.
Because if you don't have the money for the expert.
And that's not as sexy as DNA. So maybe in some cases, what do you need that for?
All right, I got to ask this. Any firsthand knowledge
of
any of these? Again, without naming names.
I just think of one case I had that was just smacked of this from start to finish. And again, the defendant might not have been the greatest guy in the world, but you just looked at all the roadblocks that were thrown in his way. And in fact, in this case, there was they had interviewed him at the police station. They accidentally left the tape recorder on. And some of the stuff you heard afterwards, you knew they were out to get this guy, in the worst way. So, I think sometimes there can be, back to the eyewitness identifications, there could be coaching of the witness, oh, you sure it's not the guy? You sure? Get another look at that.
Right.
So I know some of that goes on. I mean, sometimes you hear, some of these cases I hear that maybe before the preliminary hearing there wasn't an identification, but then magically when it's time for court, now the witness changes their testimony. Could be the witness is not reliable, but could it be some coaching? Who's to say?
Sometimes I kind of feel for these pro pers, because I can see why they want to manage these. They want to get a hold of every single piece of evidence because
why trust it?
Exactly.
Why trust it? Because if it's 1 in a million, man, and that's your life, then that's important. So, a lot of the pro pers are very detail oriented, and they realize, hey, this is my life, man. No matter what, even if I have the best attorney in the world, it's not their life. They're not going to the jail. So who better to really get in there and get all the discovery and poke at every little thing?
All right, so let's go on to the next link in the chain, which is the prosecutorial misconduct.
Okay, so Grisham wrote, most prosecutors are also honest, hardworking professionals, but some have been known to hide exculpatory evidence, encourage witnesses to commit perjury, lie to jurors, judges and defense lawyers, use the testimony of bogus experts, or ignore relevant evidence beneficial to the accused.
Okay, so once again, this is just scary to even think about, because obviously, you don't have the resources. And then if they're cheating and lying on top of that, really, what chance does the average person have?
Yeah, I mean, there's this obligation to turn over exculpatory evidence, but if you don't know exists, how can you call them on whether or not it's there? It's just impossible. And what I find sometimes what disturbs me is if there's a DNA results and I want to get all the discovery, meaning I want all the notes, all the testing records, all the photographs, all the procedures, all the data, it's hard to get. There's a lot of resistance and it takes forever. And I'm thinking, well, why is that? And sometimes misconduct is one thing, but just being inept is another, because attorneys on both sides don't understand DNA. So they might say, well, I turned the report over to you. What's your problem? Well, you turned over 3 pages. There's 500. So sometimes they just don't know. And that's equally dangerous.
Right. Oh.
And you think
equally scary as well.
Well, and then you think about, like, again, post-conviction DNA testing, like, prosecutors object to it. It's like, why? If it's reasonable, then why don't we get the truth one way or the other? Because, hey, there are times when defendants ask to get things tested and it just digs them deeper. Yep. Let them have the opportunity one way or the other.
Okay, false confessions.
All right. So according to Grisham, most jurors find it impossible to believe that a suspect would confess to a serious crime he didn't commit. Yet, the average citizen, if taken to a basement room and subjected to 10 consecutive hours of abusive interrogation tactics by experienced cops, might be surprised at what they would say. Of the 330 people who were exonerated by DNA evidence between 1989 to 2015, about 25% gave bogus confessions after lengthy interrogations. Almost everyone recanted soon after.
I'd like to think that I'd be that one person that if I was, innocent, that I would just say, no, I didn't do it. But, when you put it, when you frame it like this, everybody has a tipping point.
It seems absolutely preposterous to confess to something that you didn't do. But what are you being told? First of all, you're being physically broken down. Maybe you're in that room for 24 hours. But, a lot of times the rap is say, listen, if you don't confess to this, man, we're going to go for the death penalty. If you confess this, we'll give you a break. You'll be out in 10 years. You'll see your family. You'll raise your kids. But if you don't, essentially, we're going to kill you. So when you're faced with that, and if you don't have resources and you don't understand the system, I can see why you would take that deal.
I get it. If that's what you're looking at and that's what they're telling you, especially if you're not that familiar or haven't not been in the justice system before.
This can poison things downstream, too. A lot of scientific experts, there's a question, do you show them the person's history? Do you show them reports? Because let's say I'm working on a case and I see that the guy confessed. Do I just say, what am I going to find in the DNA? Is everybody going to say, well, I know it's a confession, but is it really a good confession? And so if people put too much stock in that, even the people helping the defendant, there might be a bias that way, when in fact the confession was coerced.
It just sounds like there's a lot of box checking.
It just multiplies itself, yeah.
Faulty eyewitness identification.
Okay, so according to Grisham, he says, more often than not, those who witness violent acts have trouble accurately recalling the facts and identifying those involved. Physical and photo lineups may exacerbate the problem because police manipulate them to focus suspicion on favored suspects.
This is the one thing that I hear in the media most is the faulty eyewitness identification. And, a lot of the exonerations that have been in the media recently as well, they were all convicted by faulty eyewitness identification. And it was the DNA that was retested that set them free.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we already talked about the subjectivity in this. And then again, maybe the decision to even do DNA by a prosecutor, they might say, oh, I have an eyewitness confession. What do we need?
Yeah, you don't need it.
10 years ago, that would have flown. Now there's CSI on TV and people are a little bit more hip to forensic science. So that's not as common. But 10, 15 years ago, you got several cases to do and you have some strong evidence and DNA is limited. Maybe say, forget it. We got an eyewitness ID.
How much pressure and eyewitness what's the word I'm looking for?
Coercion.
Thank you. Is there on the eyewitnesses?
Well, the problem is a lot of it probably is subtle. It's not like literally gun to your head, identify this person.
This looks like your guy.
But it's essentially and there are people, like I say, who are experts in that and will look at how that lineup was conducted, what the person was told, all that kind of stuff. But, passage of time is an issue as well. Like today, we had a very long day. I can't remember exactly what I ate for breakfast,
right.
Necessarily, much less someone who was involved in a crime 3 months ago or whatever. Kind of to throw DNA into this, we have the standard mugshot that's sometimes used, the police sketch, hey, describe the guy,
right.
Blah, blah, blah. And now in DNA, we've got what's called phenotyping. So let's say you have DNA at a crime scene. Of course, you're going to try to match it to the individual or the database, but sometimes you don't have any of that. Now the DNA can be tested and some of the physical traits of that person can be determined, and you can actually get like a genetic mugshot of the person. So even mugshots are being refined by this technology, or at least there's the potential. Yeah,
there's been a lot of success with that as well, that the phenotyping.
Yeah, you're seeing more and more of that for sure.
Jailhouse snitches, my favorite.
Oh man, okay. So
now wait, before you go in, you must have some stories about that.
Well, there's a lot of high-profile stories. I mean, you think about what happened in L.A. County to Sheriff Baca. The whole thing, there was an FBI informant in there and all the cover-up. I mean, that essentially led to, I think it's Tanaka, the undersheriff, and Baca getting in a lot of trouble. And, well, let me read this first, and then I have another example I'll give you. Grisham said, in every jail, there's a career criminal staring at a long sentence. For leniency, he can be persuaded to lie to the jury and describe in great detail the confession overheard from the accused, usually a cellmate. If he performs well enough on the stand, the authorities might allow him to walk free.
Okay.
So, I mean, you're being bought off. You have motivation to finger the person.
Right.
Okay, headline last week. The ACLU is suing the Orange County Sheriff's Department. There have been all sorts of issues with them planting people in the jail, or not planting people, they're already in there, but using them to get information from other inmates outside the knowledge of attorneys and just not in a kosher way. And in fact, that big case in Seal Beach at the beauty salon, I know there was an issue with that as well. And now there's actually a lawsuit. So again, maybe a little dirty pool, right? Using some tricks that let's go around the defense attorney and let's use essentially snitches and people to try to get people to say things in the jail. And
now, is this legal, or is this something where if they get caught, they beg for forgiveness?
Well, there's allegations of things that are illegal. Obviously there are ways to use informants. There are ways, but
but if you're going to the next level,
right,
and actually planning people, and you get caught, and you can't use that. It's not admissible in court, is it?
No, absolutely not. Yeah. And there's legal penalty for it as well.
Like, for example?
I mean, there could be. One would think that you would face justice if you're trying to do that. But ultimately, it could destroy your case.
Now, this seems like the next one, bad lawyering is,
oh, boy.
I think we hear, and you probably see a lot of that firsthand.
Yeah, I see it on both sides. The op-ed said those accused of serious crimes rarely have money. Many are represented by good public defenders, but too many get stuck with court-appointed lawyers with little or no experience. Capital cases are complex, and the stakes are enormous. All too often, the defense lawyers are in over their heads.
Yeah, it goes back to the money. If you don't have the money, you're at the hands of this man or woman who's fresh out of law school, or has no emotional connection to you, and there's no motivation for them to go to the mat for you, right?
Well, let's even forget about motivation, but in over your head. If you're going to handle a death penalty case, at least in California, there's a lot of criteria for experience that you have to meet. In fact, I go to a capital case seminar that's put on annually, and that's specialized training for attorneys dealing with death penalty cases. So you better have an expert in handling that type of case. Any lawyer won't do.
Do you remember the numbers, the caseload for court-appointed attorneys?
Oh, I know we had talked about that previously, and we said, some states, I think New Orleans and Missouri, we're talking like maybe, several hundred per month or something. Yeah, right.
How could you possibly?
No, even if you're as diligent as possible, you cannot give each case enough time. You just can't. It's impossible.
That goes back to those why people go pro per.
Right. It's not always crazy.
Did you have a really good line from one of your pro pers gave you one time about why you went pro per? About, it's his butt,
Oh, okay. Yeah. He said, you know what? If I'm going to get effed, I'd rather F myself and not get F'd by somebody else. I'm like, oh, that's deep.
It's funny because you kind of start to get it now.
Right. So back to the bad lawyering. Okay. So let's say the attorney's qualified. One thing I see, and I actually have a post-conviction case right now where a lot of the DNA evidence The defense attorney just stipulated to it for court. In other words, saying, you know what? Yeah, we agree. We'll just admit that as evidence, and didn't pull all the discovery and didn't look at it, anything, and didn't hire a DNA expert. That's always a bad idea.
So he was just olaying the whole thing. Just olay.
Pretty much. Because a lot of times there's this attitude that, oh, they got DNA. What are you going to do?
Right.
Let's not question that. And we'll talk a little bit about the gray area.
Okay. So let's go on to sleeping judges. You don't mean literally, do you?
Well, let's see here what Grisham says. He says, judges are supposed to be impartial referees intent on ensuring fair trials. They should exclude confessions that are inconsistent with the physical evidence and obtained by questionable means, exclude the testimony of career felons with dubious motives, require prosecutors to produce exculpatory evidence, and question the credentials and testimony of all experts outside the presence of the jury. Unfortunately, judges do not always do what they should. The reasons are many and varied, but the fact that many judges are elected doesn't help. They are conscious of their upcoming re-election campaigns and how the decisions they make might affect the results. Of those judges who are appointed rather than elected, the majority are former prosecutors.
So once again, you kind of get to that bias.
You get to the bias, and, but on the other hand, one of the exciting things about law is that there is some subjectivity. That's why we have lawyers, because we need people to interpret this law. You can write down laws, but how it applies to a particular set of facts, there's different judgment, which may or may not be right. The other issue, again, is education, particularly in scientific evidence. Is the judge really qualified to make the call on some of this stuff? Have they listened to enough experts to make an informed decision? And sometimes we only know that after the case, and it's something to go after in appeal.
Okay, junk science.
Okay, so according to the article, he says, over the past 5 decades, our courtrooms have been flooded with an avalanche of unreliable, even atrocious science. Experts with qualifications that were dubious at best and fraudulent at worst have peddled, for a fee of course, all manner of damning theories based on their allegedly scientific analysis of hair, fibers, bite marks, arson, boot prints, blood spatters, and ballistics. Of the 330 people exonerated by DNA tests between 1989 and 2015, 71% were convicted based on forensic testimony, much of which was flawed, unreliable, exaggerated, or sometimes outright fabricated.
So I know you've got some personal experience with this as well.
Yeah, and let me just frame this a little bit about what we're talking about. There are a couple of forensic techniques that have really, really come under fire and have essentially been debunked in recent years. One is the idea of bite mark analysis. So if I bite you on your arm, I'm going to leave some kind of pattern in the skin. And the question is, could you then compare the pattern evidence in your skin to my teeth and make a reliable association or not? So there's been a lot of people who have been convicted by that. And, my favorite saying is it's not DNA. And so, in fact, what else happens when I bite your arm? I leave saliva behind. So there have been a lot of cases where the odontologist has said, this person left the bite mark. If they were fortunate enough to have swabbed it for DNA, the DNA a lot of times contradicts that. So again, it's a good cross-check to show that, hey, glad you're a dentist, glad you did all this analysis, but you were flat wrong. And so if you testified, and if you testified correctly and said, you know what, there's some similarities, it could have come from this person, I can't tell you 100% for sure, that might be okay. But if you go up there and say, I'm a great expert, in my training experience, this person bit that arm, that's a problem because you don't have the certainty that other techniques like DNA do. Along those lines, microscopic hair analysis. So if I go somewhere, shed some hair, you could look at that hair under the microscope and then pull a bunch of hair from my head and just see, under the microscope, are there physical characteristics that are the same? Problem is people over-relied on that, and they tried to make matches where they didn't really occur. In other words, there could be some similarities, but maybe it could be my hair, but maybe if we went and pulled hair from 1,000 other people, it could be somebody else. So again, if that testimony was too certain, you have a problem. Again, we can cross-check that with DNA. And when that's happened in a lot of cases, the conclusion reached through the microscopy was debunked by the DNA testing.
I think about this, his list of 8, and I'm thinking that this needs to be on the front page of every newspaper, like once a month. I think it would reduce crime. Like if you actually, knew what you were getting into.
Right.
You know,
Right.
you know, like if it's like, hey, look, this is what you're going to swim upstream against.
Well, the good news is that it's.
I mean, I don't want to indict the whole.
I hear you.
Justice system.
But I mean, the good news is it is in the paper more. You know, a lot of the stuff people are going to hear and say, "Oh, I already knew that." So, I mean, I guess we're getting there. I mean, there's a bit of a revolution, luckily.
Yeah.
And by the way, junk science can apply to DNA as well.
Right.
So, we'll talk about this in another episode, but not all DNA is the same. It's one thing that if there's a vaginal swab that has a ton of semen, you get a single source profile of a male, and you say, I would expect this to match 1 in 32 non-alien individuals. Well, you know, listen, unless it's an identical twin, that's essentially an identification. Not all DNA is like that.
Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit more about where the gray area is.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to stop today. Great job.
Okay, well, hopefully everybody learned something. Some of that was repetitive, but I think it bears repeating. And I think we're moving in the right direction of all this. We have the Innocence Projects. We have tighter forensic standards, and we have a lot of prosecutors stepping up. So hopefully the future is brighter.
Excellent.
Thank you for listening to the Crime Redefined podcast. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.